He walked into the bank like any ordinary man. Simple clothes, disheveled appearance, a stranger in a place where he shouldn't be. But no one knew that he was about to change everything. He wasn't a beggar, nor a loser. He was Jason Miller, the man about to invest millions in the very bank that had mocked him. Jason Miller entered the bank in his simple, shabby clothes, immediately causing discomfort among the employees and customers who couldn't help but exchange mocking glances. Their air of superiority was palpable. Not much was known about him, but his tired expression and awkward gait gave the impression that he didn't belong there, as if he were just another beggar looking for some change. As he walked through the bank, giggles and whispers began to spread. He seemed invisible to everyone, but deep down, something big was about to unfold. When he made a call to the manager, Kevin Donovan, no one knew what to expect until, as if nothing had happened, Jason turned and headed toward the parking lot. It was then, in a short span of time, that something extraordinary happened. Jason stepped out of a luxury sports car, one of the most expensive on the market, and the bank was filled with silence. The truth began to surface. He wasn't who everyone thought he was. He wasn't just another misfit looking for a handout. He was the man about to invest a fortune in the very place where, until that moment, he had been treated with disdain. Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now, let's continue the story. Jason Miller stepped into the bank that morning, unnoticed by most. His appearance was far from what you'd expect in a place like this. Worn-out jeans, a t-shirt that had seen better days, and sneakers that had probably crossed more miles than most people's shoes. His hair was a bit messy, his face looked tired, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on them. The sound of the front doors opening echoed through the quiet, air-conditioned lobby. For a moment, a few heads turned in curiosity, but the judgment was swift. The usual hustle and bustle of the bank carried on with little interruption. Jason seemed out of place. This wasn't his world, not by a long shot. The customers in line exchanged looks, some whispering to each other, some visibly disturbed by the presence of someone so ordinary. And there it was, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of suppressed laughter. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be heard, but it wasn't particularly hidden either. Behind the counter, a few of the staff didn't even bother hiding their amusement. Who let this guy in here? They must have thought. It was one of those moments where the rich and the powerful, knowingly or unknowingly, begin to separate themselves from the rest of the world. And Jason was clearly the rest of the world. His clothing was far too humble for the elegant marble counters, polished leather chairs, and the crisp suits of the employees who worked here. The bank, after all, wasn't just a place for business. It was a temple of wealth. And Jason Miller, standing there in his simplicity, could not have seemed more out of place. The employees couldn't help but make assumptions. The woman at the front desk looked at him, eyebrow raised, and then returned to her computer screen. She didn't even bother asking if he needed help. Jason wasn't her problem. He wasn't even worth the time. Still, he didn't seem bothered. He knew how this would go. The judgments, the looks, the quiet condescension. It wasn't new to him. This was just part of being a man who had learned long ago to blend into the background, to wear the facade of someone unremarkable. There were moments when he wished things were different, but today wasn't one of those days. He had a purpose, and he wasn't going to let anything derail it. Jason didn't approach the counter right away. He lingered for a few moments, taking in the hum of the air conditioning, the soft chatter of the more refined customers, and the hustle of the employees. He had no intention of causing a scene. He simply waited. But the wait didn't last long. With a deliberate motion, he pulled out his phone and dialed. "Hi, Kevin, I'm here." Jason's voice was calm, almost casual, like he'd just called a friend to meet for coffee. No one else in the bank heard the conversation, but it wasn't long before things started to change. Kevin Donovan, the bank manager, was on his way. Jason's fingers tapped the side of his phone as he waited for Kevin to arrive. The employees behind the counter exchanged confused glances. Who is he calling? Why would the manager be coming for this guy? They weren't the only ones who were curious. A couple of customers overhearing the conversation began to speculate. Maybe Jason was a troublemaker. Maybe he had been sent by another bank to cause problems. Whatever the case, he certainly didn't look like someone who would be meeting the manager. But here was the thing about assumptions. They were dangerous. And Jason knew exactly what he was doing. While the room waited in silence, the atmosphere shifted. The soft chuckle of the woman behind the counter became a distant noise in Jason's mind. The longer he waited, the more the weight of what was about to unfold began to press on the air. This wasn't just about a simple transaction. Jason had bigger plans than anyone could imagine. And while Jason waited, the question everyone was asking was simple. Who was he really? The answer would come soon enough. The bank wouldn't be the same after this day. No one could have known it yet, but the walls that divided this world of power and privilege were about to come down. And Jason Miller, the man they had judged and dismissed so easily, was the one who would make it happen. Jason Miller continued to stand there, almost unnoticed in his humble attire. He was surrounded by a sea of sharply dressed individuals, all of them busy with their own tasks. The buzz of the bank's operations was rhythmic, almost mechanical. A few of the employees shot occasional glances in his direction, their faces showing clear disinterest. But no one dared to acknowledge him. Jason wasn't the kind of person they thought was worthy of attention. No one questioned why a man like him had entered a place that radiated luxury. It seemed too peculiar, too out of place. And yet, there was a quiet tension in the air, a kind of discomfort among the clients and employees alike, though none of them would admit it. They weren't sure if it was his presence, his demeanor, or his complete lack of concern for the judgments being cast upon him. For a moment, Jason allowed himself to observe. His eyes moved over the polished marble counters, the immaculate uniforms of the tellers, and the delicate hum of activity. It was almost comical, the way he stood there, so at odds with everything around him. A man who had walked into a space where he clearly didn't belong and yet, somehow, had managed to blend into the background. He was patient. This was something Jason had learned long ago, the art of waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for the opportune time to strike, waiting for those around him to underestimate him. And they were, underestimating him completely. Jason's calmness, his indifference to the eyes that lingered on him, made them all believe that he was nothing more than an average man with no place here. And that was exactly what he wanted. Meanwhile, Kevin Donovan, the bank manager, was making his way through the building, unaware of the growing tension in the lobby. He had 100 things on his mind, as most managers did on any given day. But Jason's call had changed that. It was a peculiar call, one that felt out of place, yet important. Jason had never met Kevin before, but he didn't need to. He knew how to get things done. As the phone rang, Kevin had picked it up, expecting a typical inquiry, maybe a complaint, perhaps a request for a loan. Instead, Jason had calmly introduced himself, stating his name and the reason for his visit, though he'd left the details vague. The only clear statement was the one Kevin had heard clearly. "I'm here, and I expect to be taken seriously." That was it. No more, no less. No formalities, no explanations. Kevin had heard many things in his time, but this one had struck him differently. There was no real urgency in Jason's voice, just the firm assurance that something was about to happen, something that would matter. As Kevin hurried towards the lobby, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was different from anything he had experienced before. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that Jason Miller wasn't just any ordinary person. His unease grew as he neared the lobby, and Jason's quiet presence became more pronounced with every step Kevin took. The lobby remained relatively calm, but the undercurrent of judgment and silent ridicule hadn't gone unnoticed by Jason. He was keenly aware of the way the employees had looked at him when he first walked in. There was no mistaking it. He had been sized up in an instant. His clothes, his posture, even the way he carried himself had been assessed, as though the mere fact of his appearance dictated his value. But Jason wasn't fazed. He had grown accustomed to the way people saw him. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged based on how he looked. In fact, it had become something of a game to him, watching people make assumptions and later, watching them eat their words. When Kevin finally walked into the lobby, he paused. His gaze flickered to Jason for a brief moment before quickly shifting to the others around him. The scene was almost absurd. Jason standing there calmly as if he were just another customer, while Kevin felt the weight of something much larger hanging in the air. "Mr. Miller," Kevin said, his voice polite but edged with curiosity. Jason offered a small nod, acknowledging the manager's presence, but his eyes didn't shift from the room around him. There was something almost disconcerting about the calmness in his demeanor. "I'm glad you could join me," Jason said, his tone still steady. "There's a matter we need to discuss." At that moment, the rest of the bank staff started to take notice. They had been observing Jason for long enough, and now they saw Kevin standing before him with an expression that was, to put it simply, baffled. They exchanged looks, their interest piqued, though none dared to say a word. Jason didn't waste any time. He turned slightly toward Kevin, his voice dropping just enough to signal that what was about to be said wasn't for the ears of anyone else. "I've been watching your bank for a while," Jason continued, "and I think it's time for us to have a real conversation about what you're doing here, and where I can help." Kevin blinked, taken aback by the statement. It was clear that Jason wasn't there for a loan, nor was he there to make a simple deposit. He was making a bold claim, and the weight of those words, though spoken so calmly, made everything feel very real. Jason knew it wasn't enough to just walk in and demand attention. He had to let the tension build, let the questions linger in the air. People were already judging him, already assuming they knew who he was and what he was capable of. But they had no idea. They had no idea at all. And as Jason stood there, finally locking eyes with Kevin, the final piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. This wasn't just about a man walking into a bank. This was about power, perception, and what it meant to be truly seen. For a moment, silence enveloped the room. Kevin Donovan, the manager, stood facing Jason Miller with an air of disbelief hanging between them. The calmness in Jason's voice, the unwavering confidence in his demeanor made Kevin question everything he thought he knew about the man standing before him. What was happening? Who was this man, really? Jason, however, remained completely composed. He was well aware of the skepticism in Kevin's eyes, the unspoken questions swirling around the room, and he wasn't in a hurry to answer them. The time for explanations would come soon enough. For now, he allowed the tension to build. The employees in the bank, who had once ridiculed Jason in their minds, were starting to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the presence of Kevin, the manager who had come down to meet Jason. There was something else. The way Kevin looked at Jason, the slight hesitation in his voice, and the uncertainty creeping into his every word. It all seemed so out of place for a man like Kevin. "Mr. Miller," Kevin said, his voice still strained. "What is it that you—" Before he could finish, Jason raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Jason wasn't interested in idle chatter. He had been through enough meetings and pleasantries in his life to know that they only served to waste time. He didn't have time for small talk. He needed to make a point. "I'm here to discuss business," Jason said, his words deliberate. "But I'm not here to beg for a loan or to make a simple transaction." Kevin's confusion deepened. A part of him wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper, but something in Jason's demeanor told him to hold back. This was no ordinary meeting. Kevin could feel it in his gut. Jason looked around the bank, scanning the faces of the employees who had been so quick to judge him. He didn't say anything for a moment, but the silence in the room grew heavier. The employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what was happening or what Jason's next move would be. And then, as if to further heighten the tension, Jason dropped the bombshell. "I'm the CEO of a company called Quantum Capital," he said, his voice steady, yet carrying the weight of the words. "You may not have heard of us yet, but you will soon." The room froze. The employees who had once dismissed him were now all ears. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't even considered the possibility that the man they had so casually judged was, in fact, someone with immense power and influence. Kevin's eyes widened as he processed the information. He had heard of Quantum Capital, though he didn't know much about the company. What he did know was that it was a rapidly growing investment firm, one that was making waves in the financial world. But how could this man, this seemingly unremarkable man, be the CEO of such a company? Jason smiled slightly as he watched Kevin's reaction. He had anticipated this moment, the moment when everything would come crashing down, when the truth would be revealed, and he could see the realization dawning on Kevin's face. "You don't believe me, do you?" Jason continued, his voice calm but firm. "You see, that's the problem with people like you. You judge others based on their appearance, based on what they look like on the outside. But you can't see what's underneath. You can't see the power, the potential, the drive." Kevin stood there, speechless. He was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that the man standing before him was Jason Miller, the CEO of Quantum Capital. The same man who had walked in wearing worn-out clothes and had been dismissed as just another nobody. How had he missed it? How had everyone missed it? Jason's words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The employees, who had once thought little of him, were now beginning to realize that they had made a grave mistake. They had assumed too much, judged too quickly, and now they were paying the price. "I didn't come here to flaunt my wealth," Jason continued, his voice steady. "I came here because your bank has been making some serious mistakes. Mistakes that, frankly, I can't ignore. But I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to show you that there's more to life than money, more to leadership than power." At this point, Kevin's confusion turned to curiosity. The realization that Jason wasn't here to make a quick deal or to threaten anyone slowly began to sink in. Jason wasn't just any businessman. He was someone who understood the deeper values of leadership, respect, and integrity. Jason's eyes met Kevin's. "I've been watching your bank for a while," he said, "and I've seen the way you treat people, the way you treat your clients, your staff. You have all this wealth, all this power, but you don't know how to use it wisely." The employees, who had been silently watching the exchange, began to shift uncomfortably. They had been caught in a web of their own making. Jason, the man they had ridiculed and underestimated, had now become their teacher. They were being forced to confront their own flaws. "I'm not here to humiliate you," Jason said, his tone softening slightly. "But I am here to show you that true power isn't about how much money you have or what kind of car you drive. True power comes from within. It comes from respecting others, treating people with dignity, and understanding that everyone has value no matter what they look like on the outside." Jason paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was still, the employees hanging on his every word. This was the moment of truth. The moment when they would either learn from him or continue down their path of arrogance and ignorance. And as Jason stood there, his message was clear. Appearances could be deceiving, but true power, real influence, came from a place much deeper than wealth or status. It came from the heart. The air in the bank felt different now. The atmosphere, once light and casual, was now thick with tension. Every employee, every client, and even Kevin Donovan stood in a state of stunned silence. Jason Miller had just shattered all the assumptions they had built around him. He wasn't just some unremarkable man in tattered clothes. He wasn't just a passerby who happened to stumble into the wrong place. No. Jason Miller was someone far more influential than they could have imagined. And now, he was making sure they knew it. But the impact of Jason's presence wasn't just about his wealth or status. It was about something deeper, something that struck at the very core of the bank's culture. As Jason stood in front of the employees, who were now nervously shifting their gazes away from him, he didn't look like someone seeking revenge. He didn't look angry, nor did he seem like he was interested in punishing anyone. Instead, there was a quiet resolve in his expression. Jason wasn't here to humiliate the people who had dismissed him. He wasn't here to make an example of anyone, though he easily could have. No, Jason Miller had something far more profound in mind. "I've seen enough," Jason began, his voice steady but firm, "and I've heard enough. I don't need to explain myself further. You've all shown me exactly what I needed to see. The employees exchanged uncomfortable looks. Some of them were still trying to process what was happening, while others were simply waiting for whatever would come next. The truth was, they had no idea what to expect from Jason. He had turned their entire world upside down in just a matter of minutes, and they were struggling to keep up. Jason continued, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. I came here to show you that there's more to success than just your fancy suits, your marble counters, and your luxury cars. Those things, as you know, can all be taken away in an instant. But the one thing that can't be taken away is your character, the way you treat people, the respect you give to others no matter their status. Jason paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The employees stood there, silently absorbing every word. None of you knew who I was when I walked in here today, he continued. But I'm not interested in being judged by my appearance. And yet, that's exactly what you all did. You looked at me, saw my old clothes, and decided I was nothing more than a nobody. You decided I didn't belong here. Well, guess what? You couldn't have been more wrong. Kevin, still trying to come to terms with the situation, took a step forward. Mr. Miller, Jason raised a hand to stop him. No, Kevin. You've had your chance. You'll have to earn your place, just like everyone else here. Jason's eyes scanned the room, locking onto several of the employees who had been the loudest in their judgments. They shifted nervously under his gaze. Jason wasn't here to simply reprimand them. He wasn't here to exact punishment or revenge. That wasn't his way. I'm not going to fire anyone today, Jason said, his tone surprising them all. I'm not here for that. A collective sigh of relief spread through the room, though it was brief. Jason wasn't done yet. But here's the thing, he continued. I can tell you that each of you has potential. Each of you could be so much more than just a cog in this system. But you'll never reach that potential if you keep looking down on others, if you keep judging people by their appearances and treating them like they don't matter. The silence in the room grew heavier. The employees knew that Jason wasn't just talking about their behavior toward him. He was talking about the culture of the bank, about the way things had been done for so long. They had been living in a bubble, insulated from the outside world, judging people based on their wealth and status. Jason took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he addressed the room one last time. I could walk away right now, Jason said, his voice lowering with gravity. But I'm not going to, because I'm offering you all something far more valuable than money. I'm offering you the chance to grow, the chance to be better, to do better, and to make a real difference. A few employees, including some of the younger staff, exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't sure what Jason meant by his words, but they knew they couldn't ignore the weight of what he was saying. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation for them. This was a moment of reckoning. I'm giving you a second chance, Jason said, his voice unwavering. I'm offering you the opportunity to prove that you can be better than the assumptions you've been living under. You've all had your moment of judgment. Now it's time for you to show me that you're capable of more. Jason turned toward Kevin once again. You've been running this bank, Kevin, but now it's time for you to understand what true leadership means. It's not just about numbers and profit. It's about how you treat the people who make your business run. It's about giving them a chance even when they don't look like the people you'd normally associate with success. Jason's final words hung in the air. The room was still, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Jason had done more than just challenge them. He had given them a chance to redeem themselves, to reflect on their actions, and to change their behavior. I'm leaving now, Jason said, his voice steady. But you'll be seeing me again. And when I return, I'll be looking for something different. I'll be looking for change, for growth. As Jason turned to leave, the employees were left standing in the silence that followed. The impact of his words was undeniable. They had been given a chance to redeem themselves, a chance to prove that they could be better than they had been. But only time would tell if they would take it. The atmosphere in the bank was still thick with the weight of Jason's words. It felt as though the walls had closed in, trapping everyone in their own thoughts, their own realizations. Jason Miller had done what no one expected. He hadn't come in to cause a scene, hadn't come in with the intention of making anyone pay for their actions. Instead, he had come to challenge them, to push them toward something greater. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though everyone in the room was waiting for something to happen, for someone to make the next move. Jason, however, didn't seem to care for the tension that had taken hold. His stance was calm, composed, as though he were standing outside of the moment, observing it all unfold with a clarity that the others could not yet comprehend. But even as he stood there, not saying a word, Jason's presence was undeniable. He had already made his point clear. Now it was up to the employees, especially Kevin Donovan, to decide how they would respond. Would they accept the challenge he had placed before them? Or would they simply return to their old ways, pretending that nothing had changed? For Kevin, the decision weighed heavily on his mind. He had always prided himself on his ability to manage, on his quick thinking, and his ability to make tough decisions. But this situation was different. It wasn't just about running a bank. It was about leadership, about what it truly meant to guide people, not with power but with understanding, compassion, and respect. Jason had already shown him what true leadership looked like. The question now was whether Kevin was willing to follow suit. "I can't speak for everyone," Kevin began, breaking the silence, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I know that we've made mistakes here. We've all been guilty of judging people based on appearances, and He hesitated, glancing at his employees. "I've been just as guilty as anyone." Jason watched Kevin carefully. His expression was neutral, but there was a hint of something in his eyes, something that told Jason that Kevin was willing to change, that perhaps this wasn't just about the bank but about the people within it. "I appreciate your honesty," Jason said, "but honesty alone won't fix things. It's what you do next that counts." Kevin nodded slowly. "You're right." He turned toward the employees who were still standing in stunned silence, processing everything Jason had said. "We've been given a second chance here, and we can either keep going down the same path or we can choose to do better." Jason's gaze shifted to the employees who were now all looking at him with a mix of awe, fear, and something else, something that resembled hope. The opportunity Jason had offered them wasn't just about redemption. It was about growth. It was about taking responsibility for their actions and learning from them, instead of being defined by them. "I'm giving all of you a choice," Jason said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can take what I've said and let it go in one ear and out the other. You can go back to your old habits and pretend that nothing happened, or you can use this as a turning point. You can choose to become better leaders, better people. It's up to you." The words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, Jason saw a shift. The employees who had once been so quick to judge him were now looking at him with new eyes. They weren't just seeing a man who had walked into their world and upended everything. They were seeing a man who had come to teach them something valuable, a lesson that wasn't about wealth or status, but about character and integrity. As the silence stretched on, Jason's eyes landed on one employee in particular. Rachel, a young assistant who had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, was standing near the back of the room, her eyes focused on the floor. She was no longer looking at him with skepticism or judgment. Instead, there was something else in her gaze, something that told Jason she had been listening, and that his words had made an impact. "Rachel," Jason called, and her head snapped up. "What do you think?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by being singled out. But after a moment, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. I think you're right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've all been so focused on the wrong things. We've judged people by what they look like, by what they have, and we've forgotten that it's not about the money or the status. It's about who we are as people." Jason nodded. "Exactly." Rachel looked at her colleagues, her voice growing stronger. "I'm sorry for the way I've treated people. I've been part of the problem. But I want to change. I want to be better." Her words were met with silence at first. but then a few employees began to nod in agreement. Slowly, others began to speak up, sharing their own reflections on what had happened that day. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a simple fix, but it was a start. Jason watched as the room began to transform before his eyes. What had started as a place of judgment and arrogance was slowly becoming a space for accountability and growth. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time, Jason felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He hadn't come here to be a savior, nor had he come to punish anyone. He had come to teach a lesson that wasn't about power or money, but about something far more important. In that moment, Jason realized that leadership wasn't just about making people follow you. It was about inspiring them to lead themselves. And that was the kind of leadership that would change everything. The room was still, the weight of Jason's words hanging heavy in the air. But the silence wasn't one of discomfort. It was one of reflection. The employees, who had initially ridiculed him for his appearance, were now standing in a space that was unlike anything they had experienced before. It wasn't just about the shock of his identity being revealed. It was about the challenge he had posed to them. The challenge to grow, to change, to reflect on their actions, and learn from their mistakes. Rachel stood at the back of the room, her heart racing but her mind clearer than it had been in a long time. She had always been just another assistant, always trying to stay in the background, never daring to challenge the status quo. But now, in the wake of Jason's confrontation, she felt a sense of responsibility wash over her. A responsibility to herself and to the people around her. She had always known that there was more to leadership than just climbing the corporate ladder. But in the fast-paced world of banking, where appearances were everything, it was easy to lose sight of the real values that mattered. Jason had stripped away the layers of superficiality, exposing the heart of what true leadership really looked like. Rachel had spent years trying to prove herself, trying to climb the ranks, always feeling like she wasn't enough. But now, she realized that it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. It was about being authentic, about staying true to her values and using her voice to make a real difference. As the employees began to process the magnitude of what had just happened, Jason quietly stepped aside, giving them space to think. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already done what he came to do. The ball was now in their court. Over the next few days, things began to change inside the bank. Slowly but surely, employees started to approach Kevin with a new mindset. They began to recognize the areas where they had been falling short, where they had allowed their biases and judgments to cloud their professional relationships. The change wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was the kind of change that starts deep within, in the way people view themselves and the way they interact with others. Rachel, in particular, took Jason's lesson to heart. She became more intentional in the way she approached her work, focusing on empathy and understanding rather than just meeting the bottom line. She started reaching out to her colleagues who had been overlooked, making an effort to truly see them, to hear their stories. It was in these small acts of kindness and recognition that Rachel began to understand the true meaning of leadership. She began to take on more responsibilities, but not out of a desire. She did it because she wanted to make a difference. She wanted to be the kind of leader who inspired others, not by her title, but by her actions. And in doing so, she began to earn the respect of her colleagues, not because she had power, but because she had earned it through her integrity and compassion. Jason's influence was evident in more ways than one. Kevin, too, he had always believed that leadership was about command and control, but now he saw that it was about guidance, mentorship, and empowering others. He started holding one-on-one meetings with his employees, focusing not just on their performance, but on their well-being. He asked questions about their personal goals and struggles, genuinely listening to what they had to say. And as the days turned into weeks, the culture of it was subtle at first, small gestures of kindness, moments of authentic connection. But it was there. The employees began to collaborate more, support each other more, and hold each other accountable in ways that they hadn't before. They weren't just co-workers anymore. They were a team, united by a shared sense of purpose. Jason, for his part, continued to observe from afar. He had given them the tools they needed to succeed, but it was up to them to use them. And from the looks of things, they were doing just that. Rachel had become one of the most vocal advocates for the new culture of the bank. She wasn't afraid to speak up anymore, to challenge the old way of doing things. And as her confidence grew, so did her influence. She had become a true leader, not because she had a title, but because she had the courage to. But it wasn't just the employees who were changing. The clients who came into the bank, once treated as mere transactions, were now being greeted with warmth and respect. The same judgmental attitudes that had once permeated the bank's interactions with clients were slowly being replaced with a more genuine approach. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about building relationships, about understanding people's needs and help. Jason had shown them the way. He had opened their eyes to the truth that had been staring them in the face all along, that success wasn't about money, power, or status. It was about people. It was about how you treat others, how you lead with empathy, and how you stay true to your values even when no one is watching. As Rachel sat at her desk one afternoon, reflecting on the changes that had taken place in the bank, she couldn't help, not for the success of the bank, but for the success of the people she worked with. They had all grown, all evolved, and in doing so, they had become something far more valuable than just a group of employees. They had become a community built on trust, respect, and a shared sense of purpose. And as she thought about the future, she knew that this was just the beginning. The lessons they would carry them forward, not just in the bank, but in every aspect of their lives. They had learned that true leadership wasn't about telling people what to do. It was about inspiring them to be their best selves. The days that followed Jason Miller's visit to the bank were nothing short of transformative. It wasn't just a shift in the way the employees saw themselves. It was a shift in the very fabric. The lessons Jason had instilled in them weren't just theoretical concepts. They were lived experiences, something they could see and feel in every interaction, in every decision they made. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the one that happened inside the people themselves. Jason's message was clear. True success, true leadership, it was about the ability to connect with others on a deeper level, to treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or position. For Rachel, the change was palpable. She had always been an assistant, always doing what was expected of her, staying in the shadows trying to prove her worth. But now, she was stepping into the light, leading with confidence and authenticity. It wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder anymore. It was about making a real. She had learned that leadership didn't come from a title. It came from within. Jason's visit had ignited something in her. It wasn't just about following orders or meeting deadlines. It was about the people she worked with, about the lives she could impact. She no longer saw herself as just another cog in the machine. She saw herself as someone who could shape the culture, someone who could lead by example and inspire others to do the same. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old ways seemed to creep back in, when the pressures of the job weighed heavily on her shoulders. But each time she found herself questioning her path, she thought back to that moment when Jason had stood in front of them, challenging them to be better, to do better. That was the moment, and every time she felt herself slipping back into the old mindset, she reminded herself of what Jason had said. True power comes from within. It comes from respecting others, treating people with dignity, and understanding that everyone has value, no matter what they look like on the outside. Rachel wasn't the only one affected by Jason's visit. Kevin Donovan, the bank manager, had gone through. As the head of the bank, Kevin had always thought that his role was to manage operations and ensure that everything ran smoothly. He had focused on numbers, on profit margins, on maintaining the status quo. But Jason had shown him a different kind of leadership, one that wasn't focused on control or authority, but on trust, empathy, and empowerment. Kevin had begun to spend more time with his employees, not just as their boss. He had learned to listen, to ask questions, and to make decisions that were in the best interest of the people he worked with. And as he did, he noticed something incredible. His team started to respond. They were more engaged, more motivated, and more willing to go above and beyond. But the change wasn't just within the walls of the bank. It spread outwards, affecting the clients they worked with, the community. The bank had always been a place of business, but now it was a place of connection. Customers were no longer just numbers on a balance sheet. They were people with stories, with goals, with dreams, and the employees of the bank began to see them as such. The bank had started offering financial education programs, workshops for small business owners, and support for those who had been overlooked by the traditional banking system. It wasn't just about offering loans it was about building relationships, about being a trusted partner in the community's success. And through all of this, Jason watched from the sidelines. He hadn't expected a complete overhaul in a matter of days, but he had seen the seeds of change being planted. He had given them the tools they needed, but it was up to them to cultivate the growth. And that, in itself, was a victory. The truth was, Jason wasn't interested. He didn't want to fix the bank or make it into something it wasn't. He just wanted to show the people who worked there that they were capable of more, that they had the power to change not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they came into contact with. As Jason stood outside the bank one afternoon, watching the employees interact with customers in a way that felt more genuine, more personal, he knew that his work was done. He had done what he came to do. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The lessons he had shared weren't just lessons about leadership. They were lessons about life, about how to be a better person, a better colleague, a better human being. Jason had shown them that the true measure of success wasn't in the size of your bank account or the number of people you could control. It was in the way you treated others, in the way you led within. As the days went on, Rachel found herself reflecting on what had happened, on the journey she had been on, and on the road ahead. She knew that the work was far from over. There would be challenges, setbacks, and obstacles along the way. But she also knew that the path she was on now was the right one. It was the path of true leadership, the path of empathy, respect, and growth. And for the first time, she wasn't just excited for her career, but for the impact she could have on the world. She had learned that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about making a difference. As she looked out the window of the bank, she saw the same faces, the same clients, but this time, she saw them differently. She saw them as people, as partners in a shared journey. And she knew that together, they could achieve something much greater than anyone. And so, the story of Jason Miller, of the lessons he taught, continued to live on in the hearts and minds of those he had touched. His legacy wasn't in the wealth he had built, or the power he had gained. It was in the way he had shown others how to lead with purpose and compassion. Jason Miller had taught them that true leadership was not about titles or authority. It was about how you made people feel, how you empowered them to be the best, and that ultimately was what had the power to change everything. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion.